The snow fell softly that December evening as Margaret Ross sat on the frozen bench at the bus stop. Her thin scrubs offered little protection against the biting wind and her worn jacket had long since lost its ability to keep out the cold. She pulled her arms tight against her body trying to preserve what little warmth remained. Margaret had been a nurse for 30 years. She'd seen countless patients through their darkest hours and celebrated with families during moments of joy. But lately life had become harder than she ever imagined. Her husband had passed 2 years ago and the medical bills from his long illness had drained their savings. Now at 58 she worked double shifts at the hospital just to keep her small apartment and put food on the table. The last bus had broken down 3 stops away. The next one wouldn't come for another hour. Margaret checked her phone. The battery was nearly dead and she had no way to call anyone even if there was someone to call. Her daughter lived across the country with her own family and Margaret didn't want to burden her with worries. She closed her eyes and thought about warmer days. Summer picnics with her husband. Teaching their daughter to ride a bicycle. Simple moments that once seemed ordinary but now felt precious beyond measure. A car pulled up to the curb. Margaret didn't look up at first. Cars came and went all the time. But this one didn't leave. She heard a door open and footsteps crunching in the snow. "Excuse me." Margaret looked up to see a man in an expensive coat standing before her. He appeared to be in his early 60s with kind eyes and concern written across his face. "The bus isn't coming," she said quietly, assuming he was looking for directions. "I know," he replied. "I heard it on the radio. Are you waiting for it?" Margaret nodded. "The next one should be here in about an hour." The man looked around at the empty street and falling snow. The temperature was dropping quickly. He looked back at Margaret and saw her shivering despite her attempts to hide it. "You'll freeze out here," he said gently. "Please let me give you a ride home." Margaret had been raised to be cautious of strangers. She shook her head. "That's very kind, but I'll be fine." The man didn't move. He studied her face for a moment and then did something unexpected. He took off his coat and held it out to her. "At least take this while you wait." "I couldn't," Margaret protested. "Please," he insisted. "I have a warm car right there. You need it more than I do." Something in his voice reminded Margaret of her own father. A goodness that couldn't be faked. Still she hesitated. The man smiled softly. "My name is Richard. Richard Campbell. I own a medical supply company downtown. I was on my way home when I saw you sitting here and I just couldn't drive past." "You work in medical supplies?" Margaret asked. "For 40 years now," Richard said. "Started from nothing and built it up piece by piece. My late wife was a nurse. She passed 5 years ago. Cancer." Margaret's expression softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. And I'm sorry for whatever has brought you to this cold bench tonight," Richard said gently. "Please let me help. No strings attached. Just one human being helping another on a cold night." Margaret looked into his eyes and saw only kindness. She thought about what she would tell a patient in this situation. Sometimes accepting help isn't weakness. Sometimes it's wisdom. "All right," she said quietly. "Thank you." Richard's face lit up with relief. He helped her to her feet and guided her to his car. The warmth inside was immediate and overwhelming. Margaret hadn't realized how cold she'd become until the heat surrounded her. As Richard drove, Margaret found herself talking. Perhaps it was the warmth or the kindness of a stranger or simply the exhaustion of carrying everything alone for so long. She told him about her husband. About the bills. About working double shifts and still barely making ends meet. Richard listened without interrupting. When she finished he was quiet for a moment. "Where do you work?" he asked. "Mercy General Hospital," Margaret replied. "I've been there for 23 years. Richard nodded slowly. "That's a good hospital. They do important work there." They drove in comfortable silence for a while. When they reached Margaret's modest apartment building, Richard pulled over but didn't immediately unlock the doors. "Margaret," he said carefully, "I'd like to ask you something and I want you to know you can say no without any hard feelings." Margaret looked at him curiously. "My company has been looking for someone to oversee our quality control department. Someone with real medical experience who understands what nurses and doctors need in the field. The position pays well and the hours are reasonable. Would you be interested in interviewing for it?" Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "I don't understand. I've learned to trust my instincts about people," Richard said. In 30 minutes you've shown me more grace and dignity than most people show in a lifetime. You didn't complain. You didn't ask for anything. You were simply trying to get home after what I'm guessing was a very long shift. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." Tears filled Margaret's eyes. "This is too much. You don't even know me." "I know enough," Richard said kindly. "And I know my wife would have wanted me to help. She always said nurses were the backbone of healthcare and we should treat them like gold." Margaret wiped her eyes. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come in for an interview next week," Richard smiled. "After that we'll see what happens. No pressure. Just a chance." That interview led to a job. The job led to financial stability for the first time in years. But more than that, it led to friendship. Richard became a regular presence in Margaret's life. They'd have coffee on Sunday mornings and share stories about their late spouses. They'd discovered a shared love of old movies and classic jazz music. Margaret's daughter visited for Christmas that year and met Richard. She pulled her mother aside and whispered, "He looks at you the way Dad used to." Margaret blushed. "We're just friends. For now," her daughter said with a knowing smile. She was right. By spring Margaret and Richard had grown closer. Their friendship had deepened into something neither had expected to find again. Love at their age felt different than it had in their youth. It was gentler, more patient, built on shared loss and mutual understanding. 2 years later they were married in a small ceremony at the same church where Margaret had married her first husband. Her daughter stood beside her and Richard's son stood beside him. There were no ghosts in the room, only gratitude for second chances. Margaret still worked at Richard's company but now as a partner. Together they'd started a program providing free medical supplies to nurses and caregivers in need. They called it the Grace Project, named after Richard's late wife. On their first anniversary Richard took Margaret back to that bus stop. It was summer now and the bench was warm in the afternoon sun. They sat down together and Richard took her hand. "Do you remember what I said to you that night?" he asked. Margaret smiled. "You said I was coming with you." "I meant it in more ways than I knew," Richard said softly. "You've come with me through every day since then. You've made my life full again. You've reminded me that it's never too late for happiness." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "That night I was so cold and tired. I'd almost given up hope. And then you appeared like an answer to a prayer I'd been too proud to say out loud." "We saved each other," Richard said. "That's what love does." They sat together in the warm sunshine at the place where their story began. Two people who had known loss and loneliness had found each other on the coldest night and built something warm that would last. Sometimes kindness is a coat offered to a stranger. Sometimes it's a ride home. And sometimes it's recognizing the dignity in another person and offering them not charity but opportunity. Richard had seen Margaret not as someone to be pitied but as someone with value to offer the world. That recognition had changed everything. It had given Margaret back her sense of purpose. It had shown her that endings can become beginnings. And it had reminded both of them that human connection is the greatest gift we can give or receive. As the sun set that evening they walked hand in hand back to the car. Neither of them looked back at the bus stop. There was no need to. The past was the past and they were moving forward together into whatever came next. And that was exactly where they were meant to be.